Yeah.
Yeah.
Lovely. Okay. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to this afternoon's session being hosted by the Nature Friendly Farming Network and in combination with our friends at the Woodland Trust as well. This afternoon, we're going to have a look at bringing in agroforestry into upland areas. And we've got a great panel of speakers and also time for your questions. So please do pop them into the chat and let us know what you would like to ask. And wherever possible, we'll try and bring you on live as well in the session later on. So we have three speakers today. We have Nick Renison, who's based up in Cumbria. And we also then have Andrew Barber, who is joining us by telephone. Our internet link's a little bit unstable today and things, so Andrew's on the telephone. So we do have some slides, but I will be controlling those for Andrew. And then we have Pete Leeson, who's an advisor with the Woodland Trust. All of these speakers are going to be able to deliver their various 15 minutes of delivery, and the whole session will be chaired by Helen Cheshire from the Woodland Trust as well, and she'll be able to coordinate and ask through the questions after the main panel delivery as well. We hope you have a great afternoon, and please do join us and put as many questions to the session as you like. Thank you very much. Over to you, Helen.
Thanks very much, Alison, and yes, welcome to everybody. Yeah, we've got a great session this afternoon. So just very quickly, before I introduce Nick Renison as our first speaker, I just thought I'd share my definition of agroforestry, because I think, you know, there's quite a lot of different various definitions and understandings of what it is. So simply, I just say it's the deliberate integration of trees and shrubs into farming systems. And the aim is to maximize the benefits from the ecological and environmental interactions that occur. So it's all about the right tree in the right place for the right reasons. And if that's done well, then it will avoid the trade-offs which can occur in many modern farming systems, and as a consequence will deliver a range of benefits both to the farm business, such as shelter, wood products, water management and browse, but also simultaneously deliver a whole range of benefits to society. Perhaps the two obvious ones are wildlife habitats and helping to tackle climate change. And I think it's important to visualize what it might look like, and it very much includes the traditional practices such as hedgerows, shelter belts and wood pasture, which is obviously a very important habitat up in the uplands, as well as more innovative approaches such as alley cropping. So as Alison said, we've got two really excellent, we can have two first-hand experiences of two farmers who are practicing agroforestry up in the uplands, as well as an experienced advisor from Cumbria. So yeah, please put your questions in the chat, and over to you, Nick.
Hi everyone, just let me do this bit. I'm not very good at working under pressure. Can you all see a big grey landscape?
All good.
Yes, we can. Yep.
All good.
Excellent.
Okay. So thanks very much for asking me to speak today. I'm Nick Renison, and I farm with my husband Paul and our two kids at Canahirf, hard to pronounce, in on the edge of the Pennines. Really, we kind of look towards the Lake District. Our land goes up to 1,000 foot. Well, just over 1,000 foot. The farmhouse is about 800 foot, and that picture there shows the Helm Bar. And when we moved to the farm, we've been here for 10 years, we didn't know anything about the helm wind, and the chap who lived down the road said that in when the helm wind's on, they used to put metal buckets on their heads and cut eye holes, cut slits for eye holes. And I remember thinking, yeah, right. But when the helm wind's on and it's an easterly wind and it's the most horrific wind, it's the only named wind in the country, and it is horrendous. So we soon realized when we got here that the need for shelter, for ourselves as well as the livestock, was really important. And it forms this bar and it kind of rolls. It's like a tornado on its side. So this is a lovely day. And if you went 3 miles away to the local village, you could drop a feather. And here it's a roaring sound, and it's just horrendous. So we kind of thought we need to get some trees planted, and this picture here is just to illustrate. There's nothing more, I'd say, dull. Pete might say this, tell me off for this, but there's nothing more it's not a great site, just lots of plastic tubes sitting there with not much growth. And to be at the beginning, I found the thought of planting trees and our landscape looking like this for a couple of years quite daunting. We've got quite a lot of big open fields, and the whole reason why the agroforestry, or just hedge planting, I like to call it really, has worked so well for us is because our animals graze in rotation. So ideally they're in 2-acre paddocks. So lots of our fields are kind of 12, 13 acres. So the idea that we can split some of those fields with hedges and then subdivide off that, it just works really well for the way we farm. But you'll see on that picture there, it's quite a treeless, hedgeless landscape. There's blocks of conifers and stuff, but there was nothing really interlinking anything, and that's the Eden Valley, I think, is probably quite bad for that. So carbon footprinting and wildlife. Well, carbon footprinting wasn't on our agenda at all when we started this. And it's still not really on our agenda, to be honest, because I think it's just numbers. But wildlife wasn't really. It was a little bit, but the main thing was shelter and being able to manage the farm better. But those two things, the wildlife and the carbon, has come on the back of the planting. So in 2013, we entered a higher level stewardship agreement, and we did lots of capital works on that, lots of reinstating hedges that had been pulled out long time ago, lots of boundaries, walls, and also some riparian corridors, and just some blocks of woodland in corners of fields which were not particularly productive. And Pete Leeson, who is one of our mates really now, he's our woodland trust man, and he was kind of paramount to making that happen. And I'd never planted a tree in my life, and neither had Paul. And he was just really good at being on the end of a phone and actually coming to actually help us plant trees. And I think going forward, that hand holding has been a real benefit. And he's learned a lot about farming, and we've learned a lot about trees. The Pond Bren project, I can remember the catalogue from that project was on in our bathroom for a couple of years, and it was just seeing those very plain tree guards and then seeing the progression through, and that's what gave me the confidence really that it's something that we should do. So I think we need more Pond Brens around the place. And then just as we've got further into the agroforestry and further into the whole regenerative farming movement, YouTube and Twitter and the kind of networks you form on social media have been really important. And the other thing is we've taken lots of photos, and my advice with this would be to take lots of photos, because you really do, you change the landscape a lot, and you forget how far you've come. And then the wildlife, there's that saying, isn't it, build it and they will come, something like that, and that's what's happened. We have a lot more birds now, and I think we as farmers, we've kind of got used to quite a silent landscape. I know there's pockets of good stuff, but generally it's quite a silent landscape, and I think we are now, nature is coming back. And then long term, whether our kids farm here or whether someone else's kids farm here, I think it's just nice to know that you're planting for the next generation. So what does it look like? So this was a corner of a field just up our drive, and it was an unproductive bit. As you can see, the sheep have kind of been charging around there, and it was all set stop prior to us coming here, so it's all quite overgrazed and absolutely no biodiversity at all. And then so that little cross there, keep an eye on that, and then that's it 6 years later. So hopefully it will never ever go back to what it was, what it looked like before. And it's just, if you walk through there, it's the kind of life that's in there, it just blows your socks off really. And then this was our hedge. So if you picture this field, All this had before was just a plain post and wire fence down the middle. And we put the hedge on a sod kest, I think that's what they call it. And the digger man just mounded the soil into the middle. And that is 7 foot wide. And this is where I quite often tell the story, but I had a breakdown when we did this, because bear in mind, we moved here, we've got huge borrowing on the farm, we'd paid so much per acre for the land, and then Renault had this idea that we were going to fence it out and put trees in it, but that I was in my purely production paradigm there, and now I can see this is probably my most favorite thing we've actually done. So that's it fenced up, and you'll see the creosote posts. That's just a good tip because they just tend to rot. And then that was it, I think in 2018. And doing the sod kest did promote weed growth, but I think that was counteracted by better take of the trees. And then that's it in it's 2020 or 2021, and we're thinking whether we should lay that now. But this is just such amazing shelter against bad weather, but also against with hot weather. And then we've kind of gone a bit crazy two years ago. So Renault had an idea for a wide hedge, a browsing hedge. Because if we've just noticed, if we move cattle into a field and there is a crabapple tree there, for example, they just all go on the crabapples. They all kind of trim the hedges back, any hazel. So this is a 5 meter wide, and this is I've just done this now. I don't know how clear it is, but so down the middle we've got oak and silver birch, and then the next line is rowan, crabapple, aspen, and bird cherry. And then the two outside lines are hawthorn and dog rose, and then hazel and willow. And the idea is that in time it will grow over, and then the cattle will graze or browse it. The fence we've got, I don't know, that the kind of the top wire is electric, so they won't be able to push the fence. There'll be still some protection there. But doing things like this is now 2 years old and it's really growing well. We did have to water it in the spring, but this is just to provide so it's going to be this massive, huge hedge, and that will also be able to maybe get some wood chip out of as well for bedding. So the lessons I've learned is variety is a spice of life. Our first hedges are a bit boring with maybe too much hawthorn. You will be the best planter on your farm because you'll have the love. But if you do have planters, pay them well, don't pay them the minimum wage, and feed them well. And speed isn't always a good thing. And also get a peat, get advice to where to plant things, what likes wet spots, what likes exposed spots. Also think about the woods we put in. We've thought about how we can actually walk through those woods or drive through those woods with a quad bike, so you can actually go in and enjoy those woods in years to come. Wiggles are good. We're just learning this probably more so now. Straight lines are quite dull. Straight lines don't happen in nature. Ongoing care, I think this happens a lot around here, but people do big planting sessions and then walk away, take the payment, and yeah, so it's that ongoing beating up, going through every year for the first few years, just patching up. Leave the guards on until the trees burst the guards. We've taken some guards off too early, and this is because in our particular area we've got lots of roe deer, and they just love nibbling things. So my next one is control the nibblers. A gun does help, and it tastes quite good. It's nice to have some deer, but too many equals chaos. Silver birch is a tree that grows really easily and obviously protects the others while they're growing more slowly. But we've had lots of silver birches just to snap off in the wind. So, and Pete did tell us to do this, but we didn't do it. It's just to trim them at the top to stop that kind of sail effect. Flowers, I think we should plant flowers as well within these woodlands. So we haven't done this, but I think and just along hedges, just for more variety. And also fruit trees, where I'm thinking, wouldn't it be nice to go and get the cows, or do a sheep move, and then have an apple tree or a damson tree just to grab some fruit off. And that's where we're going to next, maybe some more kind of alley cropping type enterprises. And I think I'm done. Yes, I'm done.
Thank you very much, Nick. That was a great whirlwind tour of your practical experiences. I think just before we move on and introduce Andrew as our next speaker, there is one question who's from Georgia. I don't know whether, Georgia, you want to take yourself off mute and ask your question about bringing the sheep back into the areas where you've planted trees?
Yes, that's absolutely fine. Hi, Nick.
Hi.
It's great. It's great to hear about your experiences tree planting on your farm, and particularly on the first example, you mentioned that was the area where the sheep had just kind of ran about, really, and you planted some trees there. Are you considering letting the sheep back in eventually once the trees have reached a certain maturity, or is that just a no-go for you, having the sheep in amongst the trees?
I don't think. The trouble is, sheep are such ferocious eaters. They if the trees were bigger and they were significantly bigger, I think then it might be an option. I'd rather put pigs in there than sheep, but we've got 120 acres of rough pasture, which we're going into a countryside stewardship agreement for woodland pasture, and we're putting cactus guards on those trees, and then the cattle, it'll just be cattle, but sheep are fine with cactus guards as well. So I think that's a good option if you do want to maintain the livestock within the trees.
Brilliant, thank you.
Thanks very much, Nick. Well, there's just one other comment. I think it was from Pete, really, in response to something that Nick said about putting flowers. Apparently you did put some flowers in some of your tree cages. So before we quickly move on, I don't know if you want to comment on that, Pete or Nick.
I think you did, but I want more.
Yeah.
I think this is something we've come to over a period of time. Is actually I've done some fantastic wildflower projects with trees now. I suppose I've been a bit scared about talking to farmers about wildflowers because it always seems a bit, But actually, we should be doing. We need to get on with this nature recovery bit, and wildflowers drive so much nature recovery. If you have an opportunity on bare ground, you should be putting in just a simple mix of wildflower seeds, if you can, just to inspire some floristic change, really, and you'll get more bees and hoverflies than anything else. So we have done it in tree cages at Cannerhoff. Red campion has been the major flower that's benefited there, but we should have done more of it.
Brilliant, thank you very much. Okay, I suggest now we move on to Andrew. Andrew, I hope you're still there on the telephone, and then Alison will drive your slides for you.
Yes, hello everyone, and thank you. Can you all hear me okay?
Oh, good.
Yes, we can.
Andrew. Yeah, I've got the first slide, the first holding slide for you, Andrew, already.
Oh, fine. Grand, thank you very much. Yes, well, good afternoon, everyone. And we're further north than Nick, as you can probably tell from my accent. And we're also a wee bit higher. Our farm sits at 1,000 feet. We go up to 1,500. So exposed stuff, most definitely upland. And I'm going to talk about some of the practical issues that arise if you go down this integration route with trees and livestock. And I guess if you're listening to this, the chances are you're thinking about increasing cover on the farm, or maybe have started to do it, and are wondering how it's all going to work. So I'm aiming to share our experience that we've gained over our farming life over the last 30 years or so. And here is a picture of the rather uninteresting 1960s shelter belt on one of the higher parts of the farm that has been key for us in our understanding of these issues. and set us on a path of trying to develop wood pasture as a land use system. We took down the fence around this wee woodland in the early 1990s after it had been thinned, and learned a lot about how the stock used this ground, both cattle and sheep. And needless to say, the cattle up here in the summertime use it daily for shelter in heavy rain, strong sun, and nightly in all weathers, whilst sheep using this ground in winter are in here in heavy snow and on any cold night. And something we only fully realized when we started using night thermal kit in fox control and realized just how much the sheep would be in there, something we hadn't really picked up on properly before that. So animals choose to use woodland if given the chance and if the woodland is structured right. And that's a lesson we've taken to heart and which we believe will be key for animal welfare in the years ahead. So next slide, please. Wood pasture, and this point about losing land for farming, it's the commonest issue we are asked about. And this actually was the one that pushed us towards wood pasture as a way to provide shelter, grow trees for timber, and that was a key thing for us. Biodiversity, early grass, all the benefits that you would expect without losing ground in perpetuity from the farm. And that was something we just didn't want to do. By the early 2000s, we were keen to expand the shelter on the farm, and we were starting to think about how to do it as we were losing our existing shelter belts to wind blow. But we didn't want to lose ground to trees, and that's a standard farmer thing. So we reckon that wood pasture might be worth a try, as we could do it at a scale that would make sense from the timber point of view and get around the problem of scale that we shelter belts throw up. And we knew that this rather boring looking shelter belt you saw in the first slide was saving us about £4 a head in feed costs for the sheep through the winter, and has allowed us to move from an outright hill breed, it was the Blackie we had here, to more of a commercial type, which our ground can sustain through the rest of the year, but which wintering on open ground at high altitude was just problematic. That wood that you saw in that first slide was in fact a living shed, not our original phrase, I hasten to add. So we saw wood pasture as a good way to go forward in the spirit of diversification. And our experience has been positive over these last couple of decades. So much so that we are now planning larger areas on a neighbouring block of hill land that we're taking on this winter, where bracken is making the land unproductive and is causing a loss of biodiversity. We think trees present a real opportunity there to provide a long-term solution to the bracken issue, and will lead to agricultural as well as biodiversity improvements to the farm. So the next slide, please. So here is our definition as to what wood pasture is, and we haven't drawn this from some textbook, so it may have absolutely no value, but this is what we see it as and what we're trying to develop. And when we talk about trees, we're talking about something between a 30 and a 60% canopy cover. Much below 30, you're talking about sort of parkland kind of stuff. And above 60, you're talking about conventional woodland. So we think it's somewhere in that area. And that's pretty much what the Europeans, the kind of definitions Europeans use. And they've got lots of this stuff. So we'll come to these three bits as we go through, as I go through just now. Can we move on to the next slide, please? Which hopefully says how to establish. And this is the second. It's on now, good. Well, this is the second question folks ask us. If you're not losing land to the farm, how do you get the trees away? And so what we've done is to use conventional stock fence, and there's a bit on the right-hand side, to which you'll see there's a top wire there, and that's to keep red deer out. What we've done was to exclude stock for the first 5 years until the trees were away. And we did this on the grant-aided areas we planted. We couldn't afford any risk of failure. So we lost the land for a few years and managed around this. And that time, I think that was established in 2009. We had moved to a rotational grazing system, and that gave us space for better utilization of grass. And we'd also reduced the number of sheep when we moved from blackies to white-faced animals. So we actually improved our financial performance. We had better margins doing that. that all helped us and gave us a bit of breathing space. But we also trialled a different version without grant aid and did a 2-hectare lower density system, principally with birch and rowan, with tubes where the cattle were kept out with a hot wire and the sheep grazed around. And that worked pretty well for us, actually, surprisingly. So it was a risk we took. And so we've used that approach since for smaller areas around field margins, which we've done without grant aid. And we've pretty much done one area a year since 2015. And you can see a sheep on the left there, and amongst these, there's a bit more work, particularly if your sheep are carrying a lice burden. They shouldn't carry a lice burden, but inevitably sheep seem to get that. So you've got to watch out for that. But it does work. But it's never going to be an approach, at least not with that type of protection, that you're going to get grant aid on, and certainly not up north of the border. If you, well, there's another point here, and sorry, the problem with having being on the telephone is you get distracted by people trying to phone you. Apologies. But as I said, that sort of low impact approach has worked well around the field margins. But one issue that we potentially would have is if the department came onto the ground and decided to remap everything because you see there's a hot wire around. We've had that problem once before. The last thing we could afford to do is to have our IX map changed. It's a bureaucratic nightmare. So any farmer listening to this, you'll understand what I mean. That issue of bureaucracy is our biggest fear. And I know the department are incapable of listening to something as entertaining as this session this afternoon, so I'm quite safe in saying this. But that is our biggest problem. Next slide, please. And so if we move on to these three components of wood pest pasture, the next question that people ask relates to possible negative effects on animal health of having animals in amongst trees. And these questions are always framed in negative terms. And I can honestly say that our experience has only been positive. Cattle in particular are able to show their full range of behaviors if they are given a choice of access. And here you see itching and rubbing is really pleasurable to these animals. It's really a necessary part of their life. And you can tell from what the cow is doing with her tongue, this is a happy cow here. Flies have not been a problem for us, and I know we're in a different environment from the low ground, but by letting animals in, underneath and through trees, you don't get that poached edge to the field that we used to see when animals can only get side shade, when there's a fence between the stock and the trees. And that kind of environment attracts flies. So that's only good for stock. But I think this question of adaptive behavior is key to animal welfare. And I realize this is probably rather controversial. I would suggest that the closely controlled grazing systems, such as mob grazing, presents a problem in this regard if shelter is not provided. And I think, I couldn't see Nick's slides, but I guess she has managed to do that. She's got a structure in there with the hedgerows that gets around that problem. And that's just brilliant, and that's good. But one striking example for us of this adaptive behavior, we saw this summer in that heat, when literally all the newly clipped sheep, when we were clipping, were sheltering underneath trees, every single one, avoiding the strong sun, while the remaining unclipped sheep were dotted around the neighbouring open ground. That's adaptive behavior for thermal stress, as plain could be seen. So if we move on to the next slide, which hopefully says tree welfare, slide 6.
All good, yes.
Thank you. The next question that comes to us relates to tree damage. And I have to say that we've virtually none on the blocks of trees that we've opened up the stock to, despite high stalking densities. Bark stripping has been confined to bird cherry, which amazingly survives it. In fact, even seems to thrive in it. It survives everything. Norway spruce in some of the old shelter belts has also suffered bark stripping. Otherwise, no, even ash, which you would normally expect. Compaction around roots is not a problem due to the number of trees and the fact the animals distribute through them. If you just plant a few trees, you're going to get compaction when the animals crowd underneath the trees, and it clearly depends to a degree on soils too. We had some lambs walking up trees when we'd taken the tubes off too early. I hear what Nick says on that. And they can climb in a way they'll stand up and walk a tree over. They can stand up in a way that their mothers don't, certainly not with the kind of Petzl Klin cross sheep we've got. I think hill sheep will be a bit more agile there. You've got to look out for that. So the trees need to be robust enough not to be pushed over. And leaders obviously need to be above browse height. And the folks who visited here, the farmers who visited here, are particularly interested to see how robust trees are in the presence of cattle. And that is always a surprise to people. We let the cows into these wood pasture plantings we planted at year 9, but I think we could have done it a year or two earlier. And we put the sheep in, someone was asking earlier about this, we put them in at year 5 and kept a really close eye on things. We were nervous about it, but much more relaxed now. And so if we go to the next slide, which is the third component of in our definition of what wood pasture is, ground vegetation. And that's what people ask about. And this is where you get the main trade-off. You can see the effects. Look at these bullet points, and all this stuff was well studied in the agroforestry trials that were done in the 1980s here in the UK. The science was all worked out. But the point for us here is at our altitude, where we planted, our issue is not summer grass, it's spring grass growth. And here the effects of a partial tree canopy are entirely positive. Grass growth, in our experience, can be advanced by 2 to 3 weeks, and this is what is the hungriest time of year. And I suppose, notwithstanding the fact that I can't write English, apologies for the last bullet point, doesn't make sense, but a point I'd like to make there is that the canopy cover associated with wood pasture, it doesn't kill off the whole field layer in a way that some other afforestation models would do, obviously conifers and spruces in particular. And that means that there's a much lower risk of inadvertent damage to habitats if you're establishing out this kind of tree land use, and that could carry quite considerable conservation value. It has to be one of the biggest risks in a big afforestation program, is that inadvertently you plant up bits that maybe shouldn't be planted. It's the right tree in the right place kind of thing that Helen was talking about. I have to say, no one has ever asked us about this conservation concern, but it strikes us as being of policy relevance if there's any policy folks listening in. And then if we move on to the next slide, and this is the final point that farmers make when looking at what we've done. Is there a penalty in terms of managing the stock when you've done this? How do you manage the stock? And the answer for us is no, it's not. It's different, and the ease of management relies heavily, I stress, on the structure of rides and alleys, particularly when it comes to moving sheep. So I'm afraid straight lines there for you, Nick. Apologies. Looks very unnatural when you're in the air, but it's all about angles and what you see. But rides are needed to allow sheep to move as they want to, and they have to have open sight lines so they don't feel trapped. And you need a dog that you can be relied on to drive sheep, like this animal here. She's good at that. She does it naturally, and she doesn't necessarily need controls, because unlike in a normal field, you can't always see the dog, and that's a very, very different situation. So we go in with a particular dog. True, checking stock takes a bit more time. You can't stand at the edge of a field and just look and see what's what. But easy to get around the alleys with a quad bike, and that's something that Nick mentioned, albeit in a different kind of context. But cattle, getting cattle out of here, absolutely no problem. We call cattle, and we've never had a problem with stock, getting stock out of these kind of places. So if we move on to the last slide, which should be a picture saying thank you, and hopefully is.
You're all there, Andrew, no problems.
Good, excellent. So I have to say, I'm not trying to sell anything here. I have to say there haven't been any downsides for us. All these questions are always presented in negative terms by farmers, but farmers get this type of land use system. When they see it in the flesh, they get it. As I said when I was talking earlier about the new bit of hill ground we're taking on, we see new wood pasture as a wholly positive thing to aim for there. On our own main bit of ground, we've got heavy nature conservation constraints because all our ground, bar the hay and silage fields, are designated. So trees are seen as a bit of a no-no, and that kind of constrains what we can do. But in this neighbouring block of ground, it's outside the SSSI, and we think there's good potential there. So we're going to go for something hopefully quite ambitious in scale. And yesterday I was talking about the carbon benefits of all this, and I get what Nick is saying about figures and all the rest of it, because carbon calculators have got lots of problems built into them. But we're going to be asked to do them. Certainly in Scotland, they are coming, and we're not going to have a choice about that. All this stuff is helping very, very much on the carbon side, and it's our route to largely to net zero. So, in conclusion, I'd really like just to thank the Woodland Trust and the NFFN for giving us the opportunity to explain what we've done. And indeed, I'm kind of hoping that more than just thanking us, that the Woodland Trust up here are going to come and help us with that application for the new planting, and we'll see where that goes. Anyway, so many thanks for everything, much appreciated. And back to you, Alison.
Thanks very much, Andrew. That was I always find it so inspiring when you're talking about it, because you've been doing it for a while, and so it really gives people the confidence that you've trialed and tested things. And I think that's invaluable in incentivizing others to think about doing it. Just before we move on to Pete, I think, have we got any? Yeah, so one question that came in is about the timber. Have you harvested any of the timber yet? So that's, is that from Hannah? I don't know, Hannah, you want to actually ask your question direct, Andrew?
Yeah, it was me. I can
do.
Yeah, I was just wondering if you have harvested the timber yet or plan to, and whether you've considered coppicing as well.
Yeah, no, indeed. The older stuff we most definitely have harvested, and in fact, this year we're heating our house with stuff out of this system. We're planning a thinning in some of the younger stuff. That picture you saw of lots of strips of trees, that's now, it's pretty plain where our final crop trees are going to be coming from. So we're planning to thin. We're going to do a Swedish model with thin, not sned out the stuff, let the stalk eat the leaves as they flush, or the leaves will flush, dry out the trees, and we'll chip them to go into the cattle shed. We're going to do a trial of that next winter. So that's the plan for winter work. And it's very much designed with timber use both on the farm and hopefully sales off the farm too. On coppicing, yes, coppice species. We saw, we pretty much only planted, apart from some birch, only coppice species in those species that would coppice in those trial plantings back in 2009. And that was because we foresaw an ease of the next crop. If you were keeping a living root in the ground, that seemed to make sense from a carbon point of view, and we were thinking about carbon then, but also a cost of establishment. We didn't want to have to go through the cost of establishing again. So that was very much part of the design. Ask us next year how the coppicing is going. We'll tell you.
Thanks, Andrew. I mean, you mentioned, I think, briefly in your talk about how much the trees had saved. I think it was £4 per head cost per sheep costs each year, and it enabled you to move to more commercial breeds, which helped with better margins. Is there any other sort of? Obviously, most farmers always wanted to know what the bottom line impacts are going to be on the bottom line. Is there anything else you can share in terms of, obviously, you're saving costs in terms of wintering. You talked about the improved grass growth at the beginning of the year and the spring, which is obviously critical. Is it a similar situation with the cattle that you found that you can save costs per head?
Well, I've got no figures on the cattle because it's the different kind of feed system, and it's quite difficult to calculate these kind of things. How do you calculate the value of a happy animal? Well, one thing you can do is look at the performance of the cattle, and we have high fertility rates. We're way in the top. This sounds like I'm boasting, but we're way in the top percentage on cattle fertility. We're running 50 suckler cows here, so we have the benefit of smaller size compared with the big sort of 400, 500 cow kind of units where fertility rates can be down at 80%. And we are in the sort of 96% plus. I don't think those kind of figures.
Yeah.
And part of that, if we really push to it, is diet and how the animals are looked after, and not having a highly pushed kind of system. So trees arguably are part of that, but it's quite difficult to get precise numbers. Much easier on the sheep side, where sheep being wintered outside, and it's easier. It's easier to make claims with sheep.
And I think it's always complicated when you're trying to sell agroforestry to a sort of perhaps very production orientated farmer, because it's the trees will help address lots of either the issues or the performance factors of a farming business. They're not actually going to solve any one in its entirety. So it's a cumulative effect, isn't it, of the benefits, I think, often.
Yeah,
okay,
I think that's right.
Sorry, Andrew.
No, on you go. Sorry, apologies. I was agreeing.
Yeah. Okay. Well, anyway, we'll have lots of time for questions, so do keep putting them into the chat. But now I'll introduce Pete Leeson, my colleague, who's been being an advisor up in Cumbria for many years. Thanks, Pete.
Hi, thanks, Helen. Hi, everybody. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how life is as an advisor, thinking about agroforestry. And I'll start really with the sort of where were we? How do we get to where we are now? Really, because I think it's taken quite a long time. Helen's kindly outlined a definition of agroforestry, and we've just heard from two farmers who are very much working in this space every day on their farms. And I'm lucky enough to have both been at Cowhoof and Fincast. I've seen both farms, and I suppose it underlines for me every time each and every farm is different, each and every farmer is different. So this term agroforestry has to sit across a wide variety of expectations, people, land, and responses to that, and also business responses. So we want to have a definition which works for everybody in a sense with agroforestry. So thinking of me as an advisor, really, how long has it taken me to get here, and where did we come from? I've been at the Trust for 27 years. The first 14 of those were as a land agent, buying land, sorting out legal issues, etc. for the Trust. And then the last 12, 13 years, I've been working pretty much in Cumbria, although occasionally I annex bits of Durham and Yorkshire when I want to, but working on a landscape scale delivery project. So what does landscape scale change mean for us, bearing in mind we are a conservation charity? We recognise that through farming, development, roads, industrialisation, fertilisers, feed, river movements, ... We've created a landscape which is less biodiverse, works less for water than it used to, and is not resilient to climate change. In fact, it's less functional for people and wildlife, we believe. So my role in Cumbria is very much to seek to change the landscape and perhaps restore some of that function for people and wildlife particularly. I said I've been here for 27 years. Actually, it's taken us a long time to really work out what we think we should be doing. And it took the Woodland Trust a long time to realise that 70% of the landscape is farmed. And particularly in counties like Cumbria, most of that farmed land is grazed, and a lot of that farmland is upland. So it's very economically difficult ground. It's poor in terms of its fertility, and it has very particular attributes in terms of of people's love of the land and the landscape, but also the heritage values of that. So we've had to find ways of working with those people in that landscape. And I have to say, after all that time, we've realised the answer is agroforestry. So that's quite good for this talk. I think as an advisor, my primary goal is to keep learning and learning from as many varied people as I can meet. But despite being quite long in the tooth, I still feel I know too little, and every single day is a school day. So I think if we're thinking about this, we all need to keep learning, and days like this are great for that. Meeting people like Andrew, Nick and Paul are fantastic for that learning, and we need to keep that in the forefront of our minds. By being willing to learn and listen, we'll all create opportunities to talk with people and to gain empathy with their circumstances. And I think it's absolutely critical, particularly in landscapes like this, where we're dealing with very often farmers who are solitary. Farming is a solitary pursuit, often conservative values, often economically difficult scenarios. Solutions and options we feel are in the bleeding obvious group are not always quite so easy to put into being, depending on mindsets, economic status, all that aspect. So empathy is critical and learning are critical. So given that, what are we engaging in and how and why? If agroforestry is about bringing trees and shrubs back into the farmed landscape, getting them to be valued, then I think Woodland Trust in Cumbria and elsewhere are engaging in an awful lot of agroforestry outcomes. Going back to that point, every farmer is different. We have to put all of that aspect into everything we try and come up with in terms of an answer. But I would say that in the last 5 years, we've seen a massive acceleration in examples and an easing, I think, of some of the more terse conversation we might once have had. I still think the view about trees and the landscape is very polarized. I think especially in the sheep world, it's a much more difficult conversation to have in the sheep world about trees and the landscape. But there are notable exceptions to that where people are coming together around this idea of agroforestry. And we work at multiple levels. So there's some of the examples of places where we have worked with people. Kingsdale Head in Yorkshire. This is a rewilding project. It's looking to restore about 300 hectares of peat, create 200 hectares of wood pasture, and restore 100 hectares of wildflower-rich pasture. It's using Rigget Galloway as the browser and a small number of pigs to create disturbance. The owners are new owners. They wanted to work collaboratively with neighbours for water, biodiversity, and rural employment outcomes. And they've absolutely said that they want to have more employment on the farm than they had when they bought it. So that's a restoration project. We worked with the Lowther estate. They had an uneconomic sheep enterprise 4 years ago, which was losing them quite a lot of money. We got involved in early discussions and helped deliver countryside stewardship agreements, which have now multiplied to a number of countryside stewardship agreements. And they are in the process of restoring 1,000 acres of land at Lowther Castle to wood pasture. All the sheep have been taken off to be replaced by longhorn cattle. And wood pasture is the ultimate outcome. So if you go to Lowther Castle, you see some fantastic landscape scale restoration with a farming outcome, but it's a very different farming outcome from where it was 5 years ago. The other thing they've done there was we have done quite a lot of wildflower work on that estate, and they're adding in new businesses to their farming side. So there's a lot of honey production. And in fact, Jim Lowther is the biggest honey producer in Cumbria, and he's using the wildflowers that we helped plant to derive some of that. In a different place, we are working with the Patriot Farmers, a farmer-owned cooperative in North Cumbria with about 900 members. This winter, we are offering 60 hedge packs to those farmers. They are simply 50-metre, 300-plant hedge packs that we're offering free of charge. The downside for the farmers there is that we are asking that we want a conversation with them. So we're opening ourselves up to 60 conversations with 60 farmers, which could be warm and cuddly ones, or there could be debates, or we don't know yet, but we are opening the door to conversations with the idea that we want to engage with people we've not met before and try and learn from them and trying to put ourselves in their shoes and see what we can do in terms of increasing their hedge cover, tree cover on their farms. In another area, if you drive down the M6 or go down the railway line through the Tear Bay Gap, you'll notice quite a lot of tree planting there. We've worked with the commoners on Tear Bay Common, a group of commoners there to create scrub in a changed grazing scenario for the common. We've worked with the estates and landowners on the eastern side of that of the gap as well, and they've now got wood pasture solutions on 2 big farms there. So quite big influence on those areas. I was talking to one farmer. I won't give her name, but I was talking to her this week, and I said, "Okay, so where are your concerns now at this point in time? Where are you? What are you thinking about? Where are you thinking of going with your farmland?" And she came back with these 4 concerns. 1, imminent reduction in subsidy. 2, increased input costs. 3, more frequent diverse weather conditions, not all good. And 4, reduction overall in red meat consumption. And we had a really good discussion about this. And we had the question there being, what can Woodland Trust do to help you, and where are we at? She thinks that she needs to broaden her farming focus and look at land as an asset that she can do carbon restoration, water, heat restoration, etc., as well as production. She thinks that working with and not against nature will benefit the farm. She thinks she's got multiple asset offers, including things like camping, etc., etc. So lots of different things she wants to work with. She's already introduced herbal lays, mob grazing. They want to do more planting of trees and more hedges. They want to experiment with grazing different animals, so different sorts of the same animals, but also different animals as well. Reduced inputs. And this really looks like a changed system, inculcating trees and hedges into that system. And another exemplar where we've been working is with people like Nick and Paul, Sam Beaumont, James Stobbart. And the point about changed systems is those people have already decided to change how they farm, and plugging in of trees and hedges has been part of that change, but it's also facilitated by that change. And that 2-way learning has been really significant for us. So I think the learning is constant. The other side of that is we also, as advisors, we need to be able to share that learning and inspire other people through that learning, exemplars, and our own enthusiasm. It's often the case that when you go down the farm track as an advisor, you're one of the few people that walk down the track that isn't trying to sell something or get an instant return from the farmer. So that's actually quite a warm position to be in. And as an advisor, if you can go in and offer help and maybe free trees or whatever it is that you can offer and do that positively, you are welcomed on that farm and with those farmers. But that learning and those arguments that you need to have are always necessary in the background, because you will often be tasked with questions like, how do I pay for this? If I do this, will I lose productive land? Will it work? If this was so good, why isn't everybody doing it? And particular issues we've all mentioned earlier, fly strike. Another one, I won't be able to see my sheep if we plant trees, ... Lots of questions that you need answers for. One final anecdote to finish. I think the joy for me of being an advisor in the way that we are, which I think is depoliticized and sort of takes us out a little bit of some of the mainstream problems we have. I have one particular farmer in North Cumbria who refuses to have DEFRA on the farm. And he just about allowed one Natural England advisor on because he quite liked her. She said, you need to work with the Woodland Trust. They're very pragmatic and helpful. And he is now 4 years and 3.5 kilometres into a 5-year, 5-kilometre hedge creation project. And he said to me, his aims are shade, shelter, browse, animal health, and animal productivity. And I think these are all true agroforestry outcomes. So to finish, I think we all know that we need to keep talking to others, we need to keep learning from each other, and we need to keep sharing those experiences. And not just in our echo chamber, much, much wider. And to do this, we need skills and learning and knowledge and confidence. And perhaps this is best gained by continued engagement and sharing. So I think we need to get to it and tell everybody how good agroforestry is. Thanks very much.
Thanks very much, Pete. I'll just stop showing your nice picture of the. Where was that photograph taken?
Oh, sorry, that was one of the new Rigget Galloways at Kingsdale Head. Absolutely beautiful animals, really gorgeous.
Lovely. Well, thank you very much, all three speakers. I thoroughly enjoyed that, and I'm sure everybody else did too. We've got a good half an hour for questions. So we've got 2 farmers and an advisor. So I think there's lots of scope, I'm sure, for lots of questions. While there's a couple that have come in the chat, so I'll start with those, but please do keep putting in the chat, and Kath and I and Alison will try and make sure we don't miss any of them. So perhaps not going in the right order, but Hannah, you've just put in a question about how you might train to be an advisor. So obviously that maybe Pete can start off with that one. And if, Hannah, do you want to actually unmute yourself and ask your question?
Andy, hi Pete.
Hi.
Yeah, just wondering about how to become a farm advisor in agroforestry, possibly more broadly, and also is there a deficit of advisors? Do we need to be filling that gap as well?
There's definitely a deficit, and we certainly need more advisors. I would say one of the difficulties is that and I think we struggle with this at the Woodland Trust, is if that advisor leaves the car or the bicycle, hopefully, however they've got to the farm entrance, they walk down the farm, they can be confronted with an awful lot of questions and an awful lot, sometimes aggression, sometimes all sorts of things. We've been on farms where there's no very emotional period because people aren't making money and they're up against it. I mean, it's a really interesting space to be in. You're confronted with all sorts of things, even before you're asked questions about the trees. So I think to be a good advisor, you need to lead a full life, really. And I'm feeling like I'm only just beginning to get to the point where I'm kind of okay at it. So to try and get someone who's fresh out of university with a degree to be a good advisor, I don't know how you program that in. But go and volunteer on farms. Don't do some hedge laying for somebody. Go and learn how to lamb. Go and work with people. And try and get as much as you possibly can on all of the aspects of the things that you might come across on the farm, and also learn stuff that about forestry and economics. I mean, it's all in there. I suspect the best thing to do is probably go and become a dental surgeon, learn about people, and then come back into farming from a. You know what I mean? It's too much in a sense. That's no answer at all, is it?
That's good. I'll bear that in mind.
Thanks, Pete. And Nick and Andrew, you've probably got some thoughts on that from the other side of the fence. And obviously one of you representing England and one Scotland, and the 2 countries are at different stages of developing their new environmental land schemes to replace being in the Common Agricultural Policy. But perhaps Nick first, and then Andrew. What was the importance of an advisor, and what are your thoughts about what the role the government should play in providing farmers with advisory support as these new schemes come in?
Well, I think Pete has been, our relationship with Pete has been properly fundamental to the success of we've had with the planting, and it's building that relationship, and it's I've met quite a few people lately from different organizations who come here and they don't have the passion that Pete's got, and farmers, they come in all shapes and sizes, but they are generally quite passionate people about what they do. And when someone comes who's a bit waffly, who's just doing it as a job, that is, farmers can spot that a mile off, and it's that it's building relationships, And like Pete said, it's been able to deal with different kinds of people. Yeah, and it just worries me sometimes, the kind of people that you know, you go to university, you get a very good degree, you're quite a clever chap or girl, but then it's that practicalness which is always seems to be lacking. Not always, but often is lacking.
Thanks, Nick. And Andrew, would you like to give your perspective on that? Have you received much advice, or have you sort of learned from, you know, gone out yourself to get your advice over the years?
Our position, or my position, has been rather different in that early on in my life, my uncle, who farmed here before us, said, go and learn the ropes yourself, don't rely on advisors. And maybe that's not the right thing to say, but I took that to heart, and I'm afraid, never had advisors on. We've had folks who've helped us in different ways. And indeed, for quite a number of years, I used to help folks with agri-environment schemes elsewhere. But that's kind of changing because of the bureaucracy of grants and me getting older. I just cannot be bothered to learn to be going through all the paperwork side of things. And so getting someone who can walk you through the paperwork and the bureaucracy of it now, it's completely changed over my lifetime since I first did a scheme here. It's utterly changed. So there's a strong role on our business here. There's a strong role for advisors there, but more broadly, there is a real capacity issue which is well recognised north of the border, and not just in agroforestry. I mean, agroforestry doesn't really figure in the conversations. It's more about getting the breadth of experience into the farm advisory services, who I think have generally recognised that we need to up our game on that side. So yeah, possibly a rather different situation here. I don't know.
Thanks, Andrew. Yes, certainly some of the conversations I've been having, perhaps in a more lowlands situation in England, but I think it's relevant in the uplands as well, is the need to make the agricultural advisors and the forestry advisors actually meet and talk to each other, because, you know, then you start to get the combination of those two levels of expertise integrated, which I think is really critical. You know, I come from a farming background, and even though I've worked for the Woodland Trust a long time, don't necessarily know that much about trees. So I think it's the combination of those two sectors we really need to draw together, and hopefully agroforestry, if it becomes to be much more supported by government schemes, which may not be the only route in, then that may help stimulate some of that. It'll also be interesting to hear perhaps Nick and Paul, Andrew's perspectives on that sort of peer-to-peer learning, you know, whether you feel that needs to be or could be something that could be supported by the new government schemes in the respective countries as a way that many farmers will learn and try new things. That sort of mentoring aspect.
I think it's realizing that for a generation, or since the 60s, 70s, tree planting just hasn't been a thing that farmers have done, and there's just a massive knowledge gap. And we've learnt loads in the last 6 years, but we knew very little before then. And now, you know, we talk about bird cherry and aspen and rowan like it just falls off the tongue, but yeah, it's just lots to learn, and it's just simple things like, you know, just very basic tree planting and well, I expect we'll talk about it further along, but getting people to plant the trees, I think, is going to be a big problem in the future.
Yeah. Andrew, do you have anything to add, or? No? Okay, well, I'm sure we might come back to some of these elements of this discussion, but one of the other questions was basically, you know, where does agroforestry fit if you're in the tenanted sector, which is another, you know, problem or barrier that we hear a lot about, you know, and especially given the average length of farm business tenancies these days. So I'm not sure who would like to to tackle that one first? And sorry, I have noticed somebody's hand is up now as well. I will come back to Dennis.
I could add something from a Scottish perspective to that one. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can, yep.
Yeah. And the reason why I say that is we have a post here in Scottish Government, the Tenant Farming Commissioner, and he was looking at this wood pasture system just literally a couple of weeks ago and was positively excited about it. He could see its application, and particularly for tenanted land, because it's still agricultural production. And the big issue, certainly north of the border, is that way going. When a tenant gives up, if he's planted a bit of land and he has to get the landlord permission, which is a first hurdle, he then has to go through a valuation process, and it can potentially, if the land is deemed to have lower value than open land, the tenant has to pay the landlord compensation. And that is an absolute barrier. It's a total no-no. And so there is potentially a way forward, at least this is what Bob McIntosh saw, the Tenant Farming Commissioner, one possible way forward and value for this. He was looking at our wood pasture system, which is a bit different, I know, from hedgerows and stuff. But so he saw value in it from there, but it's recognised certainly north of the border as a major barrier, and it's a question of justice. If we use trees to get to net zero, then tenants have to be able to share in that as much as owner-occupiers.
Thank you, Andrew. Nick or Pete, would you like to comment on that from an England perspective?
Well, I would say that I work mostly with owner-occupiers for that reason. It's very difficult. Hedgerows, I think, are a slightly different story, and particularly things like mid-tier and the ability to gain some funding for doing some hedgerow work is there. But it is something that has to change, and I think we need to tackle this across multiple things. One is to get to the land agents, and that was part of my job for a long time. We are told to look as our agents that very, very financially at stuff, and capital values of farms is very much something which is clearly in the land agents area. But it was always said for a long time that a farm without woodland is worth less than a farm with woodland at certain levels, and I think we need to be engaging everybody in this conversation. But part of that comes back to future grant aid from government as to whether you're going to be paid for those assets or not. And if we are going to be paid an elm for owning woodland and managing hedgerows, then surely that adds into the capital value. So there is some hope there, but it has to be considered by everybody in the round.
Thanks. Nick, would you like to add anything?
But I completely get the tenant situation is unbelievably tricky, and I think if we were tenants here, we'd probably have thought differently. So yeah, it's a pickle, and I'm not sure how you sort it.
Yeah, I mean, there are some interesting models that are being tried, but obviously those are out where the landlords are sort of behind willing. We know of county council farms tenanted farms that have been allowed to put in agroforestry, but that's obviously at the discretion of the landlord in those situations. But yeah, it's something that certainly elm and its equivalent in Scotland need to make sure that they address. I think maybe before I ask Dennis, who's had his hand up for a while, Hannah's just mentioned a question really to Pete, was how was it working in the common context to get agreements from the landowners and commoners? So before we move on from this sort of tenancy aspect?
I knew someone would come to commons eventually. Every single common is different. It depends really, but very often the crunch point for the common is that they have been in a scheme, they want to move into a new scheme because economically it's essential for them. Natural England have become, I suppose, a bit harder over the years. There's lots of money being spent on upland schemes that have achieved nothing for biodiversity. Many multiples of millions. And I think they've decided that actually what we need to do is actually, when we go into a new scheme, there has to be an obvious benefit for wildlife. That usually means fencing areas off and planting scrub. In the Cumbria context, that needs the consent of the landowner. But in that process, there can be a financial transaction which benefits the landowner. On most commons, landowners earn nothing off the common at all. So if you're going to a scheme where there's scrub creation and there can be a payment for that in some way, then those common owners benefit for the first time in a long time. So it's usually financial transaction that makes the difference. But we've got one or two common owners who really want to restore the ancient forests to those areas. So there's one particular common owner we're working with whose aspiration is to restore the forest of Malastane. And he's taken on board all the responsibility for creating trees within the agricultural agreement. So again, it depends on people and their aspirations, but we've had lots of different outcomes and examples from the commons area. We could do a whole this exercise on commons alone.
Thanks, Pete. Dennis, you had your hand up. Would you still like to ask a question? It seems to have disappeared.
Yeah. Hello, it's Ulrich and Dennis. We are both working on a project called Organic Plus, and in this project we look, among other things, into replacing straw, especially the conventional straw and the pesticides in it, as a bedding material. And for that reason, I wanted to ask Nick and the farmers, so obviously agroforestry products is some of the things. So what are your experience with, and you mentioned it, I think, Nick, in the talk, in terms of bedding material from the trees, especially also in areas, I mean, that's a non-organic question as well, where you probably don't have any arable cropping near you for the animals to bed. Yeah.
Thanks, Dennis. So our cattle are in for quite a short winter, maybe 3.5 months, because we kind of do extended grazing. So we need straw, and that because we're not organic, but we don't use fertilizer, and that's a really valuable muck. So we up until this year, we've always bought straw in, and it's quite expensive. It comes over from the east, and so this year we bought an Arctic load of wood chip, and that's in all the sheds at the minute, creating a base, and then we'll put the animals in, and then we'll put probably straw on top of that when they need it. And this came about because Paul, my husband, has got into there's a chap called he's got the Johnson Sue composting thing. Are you familiar with that? No, you need to Google it. So that it's all to do with your muck, and we try and compost our muck. Your muck, I'm not very good at this, but your muck being more fungal than bacterial, and the wood chip is obviously good for that. So we are now thinking that the wood chip we got, the big load of wood chip we had delivered was, I don't think the chap realised how much it was worth, so we got it quite cheap. But I think wood chip will go up in value, and I think long term we need to create loads more hedges, loads more subdivision in the fields, and then have a chipper or something that will go and chip wood and make our own bedding. So it's a proper circular system. Yeah, so saying that, we haven't actually had any, and the cattle are still out, so we haven't had them in on the chip yet, but we've had some pigs on the chip, and that's worked well. So fingers crossed. But Google Johnson Sue, because it will be right up your street.
Nick, just, do you know how much it costs you to house your animals per week in the winter?
Yes, I do. So I'll give you an example at the moment. We've got 65 cows and calves that are outside, and they are just having grass, and they're having one bale of hay a day, just because the grass is quite lush and they're quite loose. So they're having one bale a day, but 1 bale a day. So that's £25 a day. Do the sums, Pete. And if they were in, they would be costing £4,500 a month. So that's like £3,000 saving, isn't it? Every month they're out.
Yeah, well, you're saving £125
a day or something like that.
Yeah.
So it's massive, and that we've been able to do that because we've got less sheep, and we've been able to. Yeah, so I think in the future that there will be less sheep just because of the way they graze.
Thanks, Nick. Andrew, would you like to add anything onto that?
Well, we're we're in a very similar position to Nick. It sounds like you're a year ahead of us, Nick, in what you're doing. But we're thinking the same kind of road. And one of the things that's pushing us down this road is not just the money, but it's the fear that we can't get straw. I think the arable sector up here is going to be pushed down the road of chopping straw and putting it back in the soil to get the carbon levels up in their soils. And if that happens, we might find we're just outcompeted for straw. The carrot boys already have, they don't seem to mind how much money they pay for straw. So there's a financial question and there's an availability question on this side. So we're really keen to find alternatives. And if you can get the wood chip on the farm and make that circular economy, it's all about numbers, then great. And if it's cheaper to buy it in, well, maybe that's what we'll end up doing. But we're certainly going to try the on-farm chipping road, and coppice systems, hedgerow systems. That all makes sense in the years to come. So yeah, watch this space.
Thanks very much, Andrew. Bill, Grayson, I've noticed you've got your hand up. Would you like to unmute yourself?
Yeah, thanks, Helen. Just to say, I think that's got to be the answer. That so much hedge trimming just puts the trimmings back on the ground or on the road, and it's a wasted resource. It'd be a much better system if we could recycle them, bring them in, chip them, and use them for bedding or just for composting. We're going to need that fertility, and the perfect way of using it is to combine it with cattle slurry or livestock manures of one form or another.
Yeah, thanks very much, Bill. I'm just getting back into my questions. So, Fraser, are you still there? You put two questions into the chat. One was about cattle scrumping the crab apples and whether anybody has looked at its potential for feed value. There you are. Would you like to ask your first question and then perhaps ask your second one after that?
Yeah. Hi, Helen. Yeah, the first one was sort of a more observation a few years ago, and it's sort of one of them things that has sort of stuck in my mind for a while. And when I keep looking at agroforestry, is the use of sort of fruit trees, and Nick sort of made me think of it when she was saying about for feeding herself, which is a good idea. But yeah, has anybody sort of looked at it in terms of, we talk about willow and aspen and the leaf side, but actually just the fruit side, there must be quite a high feed value in that sort of late in the season. I've sort of Googled it and never picked much up apart from the sort of things when you Google it of, oh, don't do that, you'll choke your cows and things like that. But has anybody else sort of looked at that?
We've just noticed that the cattle, if there's a crabapple tree in the field, they just go crazy for it. And I think like it's just that variety, isn't it? Who wants to eat potatoes every day? It's and they I think it's how it's meant to be, really, isn't it?
We have access to several orchards, Fraser. So this time of year, we go around on a daily basis picking up all the windfalls, and the good ones we keep for ourselves, and the rest the cows will get. So it's a really good way of just bonding with your animals. So they're always keen to see us, yeah. So it's worth doing.
Do you feed them whole, Bill? Or do you got them?
Yes, no, we try and adjust it for the size of the cow. So the little ones we keep for the younger animals, and the big ones, and it's quite useful because they know how to deal with them, and there's usually a bit of a scrum when they all arrive at once. So you can give these big apples to the big cows, and that keeps them out of the way while you deal with the little ones.
Brilliant. And the other one was the sort of landscape side of things, really. I'm sort of, I suppose, maybe quite traditionalist and like my traditional landscapes, and sort of probably to you, Nick, first, in terms of, have you used sort of existing hedge lines when you've put your hedge lines back in, or are you redesigning the landscape with what you've done? And yeah.
Well, our fields tend to be kind of rectangles, so we are kind of making that maybe into a T shape or splitting it in half. but yeah, I think you probably got to look at a overhead view of your farm and then just start marking off what you can chip away at. But whatever you do, you won't regret it. Just crack on.
Excellent advice.
Andrew,
what about you?
You may be picking up on a sort of internal family discussion of who wants it to change and who doesn't. I mean, I get picked on yours a bit, Nick, as well with that. So
yeah.
Andrew, your designs are quite, you've obviously, but you showed us some lovely aerial views. Have you had comments and have they been sort of positive or challenging about how you've perhaps been perceived to have altered the landscape?
No, we've never, though I found myself in a very negative argument, not in front of that landscape, but just the theory of it with a couple of senior folks from the forestry department here, the landscape architect and whatnot, and heavily criticized the idea of it for creating a striped landscape. In fact, I did help one farmer put in an application which was turned down for two reasons. One was striping in the landscape, and the other was the open ground rules didn't fit the woodland model or something. The striping in the landscape is a temporary feature because once thinning is done, that will change the outlook. And the people seem to ignore the fact that Sitka spruce production puts stripes on the landscape, which can sit there for a long time. So it seemed to be rule for one and another rule for another situation. But that's been the only thing that no one local has ever said anything about it, or any of the visitors who've come here. We've had lots of folks on the farm who've looked at it from different angles. Looks worse from the air, I have to say, but the air gives you an idea of the structure, that aerial view. Yeah, so no, that's been our experience.
I think my response to this is the Committee on Climate Change says we need to plant 32,000 hectares of woodland a year until well into the 2050s to get anywhere near our planting targets. We're managing about 2,000 hectares-ish of woodland at the moment. So we are so far off the pace in terms of what we need to do ecologically and climate-wise. We're just going to have to get used to having more trees in the landscape. We need to design those woodlands and those tree interventions as well as we can. And to be honest, accept some broken eggs from time to time. What we mustn't do is go down this dash for carbon and have carbon woodlands everywhere, which are effectively Sitka spruce plantations, which are square. So I think it's in all of our opportunities to put trees into corners, down hedgerows, field trees, and design our own bits of land or the farms we're advising on to get landscapes which work visually and ecologically and function-wise. And I think if we do lots of that at scale, we'll have a fantastic landscape in the future.
Thanks, Pete. Bill, you have your hand up. Is that another question or comment?
I think it's still up from last time.
Or is it still up?
No, it isn't. It's something new, and it is a bit different. I've seen a really interesting webinar showing how LiDAR can be used to quantify the carbon stocks in woodlands and trees on a farm. Is that, sorry, I missed the first half. Is that something that people here think could be relevant to the issues we're discussing, particularly in terms of the landlord-tenant relationship? So you could quantify how much carbon stock there was at the start of the tenancy and then repeat the exercise at the end of the tenancy. And so any adjustments could be made on that kind of basis.
Thanks, Bill. Andrew, would you like to respond to that one first? I know you've been working very closely up in Scotland with the discussions around carbon and how you might measure it.
Yeah, any technology, any approach which is cost effective and can be done through remote sensing, such as LiDAR, or has to be of interest. We have to work out what stocks we have and their dynamics, and we need to do it in a cost-effective fashion. At the moment, we are not doing that. We certainly here on the farm, there is a lot of the woodland on this farm is not recorded, it's not captured anywhere in standard woodland data. It doesn't appear on any inventories. It's just not seen by the IACS map, and that means the IACS system, and that means that the carbon that captured by that isn't seen either. So yeah, any remote sensing system has got to be of interest, of strong interest.
Thanks very much, Andrew. We're getting very close to having to finish, I'm afraid. So Nick and Paul, Pete, rather, do you have any quick responses to that?
No, I don't.
I think we need to get more and more to the point where we have one carbon accounting system, and it needs to be good. At the moment, I see multiple toolkits all upping and downing with different things, and that doesn't really help the scenario. So we need to get to one central system that works. And I think Bill's idea is great, that we account for it at the beginning of tenants and the end. That's also fantastic, because that gives you an opportunity to change carbon as an asset on a farm. Brilliant, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, and I think that's a great sort of point to end on, in a sense. I know there's lots of work going on, but we're a long way to get there at the moment. Yes, I'm afraid we are, I think, a couple of minutes from 3 o'clock. So unless anybody's got unless I've missed any questions, or anybody's got a burning question they want to ask, then I will thank the three speakers very much for, I thought, very interesting, and it's just so great to hear these things done in a practical way. It's all very well reading the theory, but actually hearing about how it's working in practice is so important. So thank you very much.
Helen, could I just chip in there? We've become obsessed with a man in America called Mark Shepard, who's written a book called Restoration Agriculture, and it's all about agroforestry. I think it's Restoration Agriculture. Anyway, he's on YouTube. It's a really good book, and yeah,
good for the Christmas stockings.
Yeah.
Okay, well, thanks very much. So I suppose my closing remark is that I've come away feeling, as I always do when I speak to you three guys, inspired. And I think we all need to collectively try and push our respective governments to make sure that these new environmental land management schemes, or whatever they're going to be called or described, actually are effective and will support agroforestry to become a mainstream land use. And I think we need to find a system, Nature Friendly Farming Network is a brilliant organisation that is doing this, which encourages farmers to learn from each other, to inspire each other, to share their practical lessons. So I think there's lots to be positive about, because there's people doing it. But yeah, we all collectively, we need to keep working at it, and we will get there, hopefully. So yeah, unless Alison, you have anything else to say, there's an exhibition area, isn't there? I think if people
yes, we're one of the sponsors of the Northern Real Farming Conference, so please do go and have a look at our exhibition area. There's some various bits of information in there, some general, and also our most recent report that we've just completed around farming and climate change, called Rethink Farming. We will be coming back to the Oxford Real Farming Conference in January, where we're having a new launch and debate around farming for climate change. So if that's of interest to anybody, we hope that you can join us at the Oxford Real. Fingers crossed it will be in person as well. Brilliant. Thank you so much, everybody, and to all the speakers, much appreciated.
Thanks very much, Alison. And yes, thanks, Kath. She's put lots of links into the chat. And likewise, the Woodland Trust will be at the Oxford Real Farming Conference as well. So come and find us there. And if we've inspired you to plant trees, go and visit our website, because we do have some help, and we have some other advisors other than Pete around different parts of the country as well. So do get in touch. Thanks a lot, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.